Einen wunderschönen guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren. Schön, dass Sie da sind, trotz der Hitze und der vielen Veranstaltungen in München heute Abend. I'm very happy to welcome Omer Bartov, who will talk about his new book, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buczacz. Professor Bartov is the John P. Birkeland Distinguished Professor of European History at Brown University and one of the world's leading authorities on the subject of genocide. Born in Tel Aviv, Omer Bartov made his doctorate, or received his doctorate from St. Anthony's College in Oxford, and since then he has built an amazing publication record. Just mention a few titles, from The Jew in Cinema to Germany's War and the Holocaust, from Mirrors of Destruction, War, Genocide and Modern Identity, to Murder in Our Midst, the Holocaust, Industrial Killing and Representation, from Hitler's Army to the Eastern Front. Omer Bartov is the editor of a number of volumes on Holocaust and genocide and contributed to journals and newspapers. He has an impressive record of fellowships and guest professorships and so on and on. I don't want to say too much about his new book, but he has traveled extensively for it to Ukraine, the region where his mother grew up, and I think this is also something very interesting about this book, and in many ways that kind of represents a new genre in Holocaust studies, and that is to work on something that is related to your own biography, and that makes a very interesting combination sort of a biographical reason to start picking up a subject and then exploring it further. The result is an amazing local history, a history of violence, a history of neighbors, friends and families who turn against each other, who become perpetrators, and not only for the 1930s and 40s, but over a much longer period of time. But I don't want to say much more because actually this is your talk now. I'm very much looking forward to it. Thank you so much for coming, and you'll all have the opportunity to ask questions after the talk. Thank you, Omer.
Vielen Dank, dass Sie alle hier sind. Es tut mir leid, dass ich diese Vortrag auf Englisch halten werde. Es wird mir leichter und vielleicht auch Sie. What I will try to do today is to give you a brief survey of what this book, this study, is about. I should say that I've worked on this study for about 20 years. I started in the 1990s, and I spent the last 10 years almost exclusively working specifically on this book, on the research and on the book itself. It took me to 9 countries. It forced me to make use of 9 languages. I worked in about 50 archives, and I used personal testimonies from hundreds of individuals, Jews, Poles, Ukrainians, Germans, a whole array of individuals. So I'll try to tell you a little bit what the main points of this book is. I'm glad to say that it will be coming out also in a German translation, so hopefully next year. I started thinking about the book in the early 1990s, and you may remember that in the early 1990s a number of things happened. First of all, the Soviet Union disappeared and the communist system collapsed. I'm sure that you're well aware of that here in Germany. And there were some individuals, especially in America, who said that this was the end of history, that we were now entering a new era. but history wasn't paying much attention to those people. And shortly thereafter, there were two genocides that put an end to this notion that it will be in a much better world. In 1992, the killing began in the former Yugoslavia, and about 200,000 people were murdered, often by their own neighbors. And in 1994, the fastest genocide in history happened in Rwanda, where about 800,000 people were killed in 10 weeks, mostly with machetes and fire, quite often in their own churches. This was one issue that started me thinking, because the second event of the 1990s was that the Holocaust, the genocide of the Jews, became an internationally recognized event. People tend to think that the Holocaust was always at the center of public discussion, but that's simply not true. I've lived long enough to see that happening. If you go back to books written in the 1950s, 60s, even 70s, say on World War II, you'll be hard put to find any mention of Judenvernichtung, of Auschwitz in the index. And even some major histories of the Third Reich often had a paragraph or two on the Holocaust. This started changing in the 1980s, slowly, but by the 1990s, there was a sense that the Holocaust now had been recognized as an event of importance not only to Jewish history and German history, but also to the history of World War II and to the history of the 20th century. That was arguably a good thing, that finally there was a recognition of the importance of this event. But there was a certain understanding of what the Holocaust was about, and I actually participated in that kind of understanding. The subtitle of one of my books was Industrial Killing. The understanding was that the Holocaust was about two things. First, it was about dehumanization, that in order to carry out a genocide on such a scale, to try and murder an entire group, one first of all has to dehumanize it, to think of it as not belonging to our own circle of solidarity. And the second was that in order to facilitate the killing itself, for the killers to be able to kill so many people, one has to distance the killers from the victims. That is, one has to create a system that ultimately came to be known as the extermination camps. That is, that you deport people from one place to another. So, for instance, you take Jews living in Grunewald, you collect them, their neighbors are looking through their windows, they see them walking down with their coats and with their little suitcases to the train station, and they're gone. They vanish. They go nach Osten. And people may have some guesses what is happening to them there, but they'd rather not think about it, or they don't talk about it. But they don't see the killing. By the time the people get to where they are going, they often don't look any longer as they did when they got on the train, because the train journey had already changed them because of its conditions. And if the system works perfectly, then within a short period of time, they're undressed, they're shaven, they run into the gas chambers, they're gassed in, if they're lucky, in 20 minutes, if they're not lucky, in several hours. And then they're either buried in mass graves or burnt, cremated. And no one in particular is responsible for the entire process. So the process is compartmentalized. The best example of this was what the commandant of Sobibor in Treblinka, Franz Stangl, said when he was interviewed about his own experiences, and the man was responsible for about the killing of about 1.2 million people. He remembered himself sitting on his white horse and looking at the people running into the gas chamber, and he said, to me, they looked like lemmings. He did not see them as human beings. They were, in a sense, running to their own destruction. He had very little to do with it, so to speak. So this was the understanding of the Holocaust, and I became increasingly uncomfortable with it. Not that it was not true, because there were extermination camps, and about half of the victims of the Holocaust died in extermination camps, but because there were other aspects to the genocide of the Jews. And I was interested in those aspects. I was interested in the encounter between the perpetrator and the victim. What actually happens when the system is not there? When this kind of detachment between the killer and the victim doesn't happen. As, for instance, happened in those genocides in the early 1990s, which were very intimate, very close, and often were neighbors killing neighbors. People had always known each other. Now, because the Holocaust is a very large event over an entire continent with millions of people involved and millions of victims, it was impossible to study this whole event. At least I didn't believe that it's possible. And so I decided to look at one place and to see what happened in one place, in a single location. And I chose a town that is in Eastern Europe. Now, it was obvious why I would choose a town in Eastern Europe, because most of the Jews had lived in Eastern Europe, and most of the Jews were murdered in Eastern Europe. So if you wanted to see the reality of what happens from below in one locality, it made sense to choose a locality in Eastern Europe. I chose the town of Buczacz. Now, why did I choose the town of Buczacz? And I suspect that most of you never heard of it. And that's the case everywhere, apart from in Israel. I chose the town of Buczacz for a number of reasons. First, as I said, it's in Eastern Europe. It was representative of hundreds of other towns in that region, all the way from the Baltics to the Balkans. Hundreds and hundreds of very similar towns with mixed populations, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But it was also a town that I knew something about because I grew up in Israel, and as a teenager, I was reading the only Nobel Prize laureate who wrote in Hebrew, Shmuel Yosef Agnon. And I actually also greatly admired and still admire his writing. Agnon came from Buczacz. That's actually not, this was not his name. His name was Chachkes, but he changed his name to Agnon later on. Agnon not only came from Buczacz, which he left like James Joyce when he was a very young man and never really came back, most of his writing was about Buczacz for decades thereafter. Now, some of the writing was specifically about it, and some was about Buczacz more as a symbol. Because what it symbolized to him was the universe of Jewish civilization as it had existed before World War II, before the destruction of that culture, of that civilization, and which he saw declining already after World War I. And I'll get to that too. So it wasn't only the destruction by the Nazis, but also the decline of those towns in the 1920s and 30s. So I thought, well, Agnon, whom I admire, wrote about Buczacz. I'll choose that town. It also is, however, the home of a number of other interesting individuals, and I'll mention two, one of whom you may know, Simon Wiesenthal, known later on as the Nazi hunter, who spent the rest of his very long post-war life in a small apartment in Vienna, trying to find not only perpetrators, Nazi perpetrators, but witnesses who would give testimony in trials, particularly in West Germany. I eventually came to his so-called archive, which was just his apartment, and he had a very, very large dossier called Buczacz. He was born there, and he was particularly keen on finding those people who killed his own family and his own community, and made great efforts to find people who would also bear testimony against him. Another very important person, you may not know about him, was Immanuel Ringelblum, who also came from Buczacz. He was a very important historian in the 1930s of Jewish-Polish relations. He wrote in Yiddish, which he saw as the new language of the Jews. That didn't last very long, but he was part of that movement. And he tried to understand Jewish-Polish relations, but during the war, he was in the Warsaw Ghetto. And while he was there, even though, of course, he did not know how things would end, he decided to create an archive of that ghetto, which is known as the Oneg Shabbat or Oneg Shabbos archive, 2/3 of which were found after the war. He, his wife, and his child were betrayed, were denounced, and killed by the Germans in 1944. But the archive, or 2/3 of it, survived, and because of that archive, we know much more than we would have otherwise about what happened there. So these were people who were related in various ways to Buczacz and to the Holocaust. But another reason that I chose this town was that my mother came from there. Although she was not born in Buczacz, she was born in a little village on the Dniester, a beautiful place, Kośmiezin. But she spent the first 10 years of her life in Buczacz. And in 1995, I decided to interview her. Now, I should tell you that my mother was not there during the Holocaust. She's not officially a survivor. In fact, in 1935, her father received a certificate, as it was called, to go to Palestine, and she, her two brothers, and her parents went to Palestine. Had they stayed another 4 years, I probably would not be here telling you the story, and none of them would have survived. And in fact, my entire extended family, and everybody had extended families there in that area, disappeared without a trace. And although I know a great deal now about how the Jews were killed there, I actually don't know specifically how members of my own family were killed. But no one came out, no one survived. So I decided to interview my mother about her childhood growing up in that town. And what was interesting for me, and I won't go into all the details of that, was that she spoke about a very happy childhood. And the childhood she described was one in which she lived in a home where they spoke mostly Yiddish. She went to a school where she studied in Polish because the public school was in Polish. This area was under Polish rule at the time. She spoke mostly Ukrainian with her girlfriends on the street and went picking mushrooms and wild berries in the forest with them. And she had very few recollections of fear or anti-Semitism. It was a good childhood. And as she was telling me this story, I realized that my original question, which was the encounter, as I said, between the perpetrator and the victim, was an insufficient question. It was largely based on my own ignorance of that area. There was, and it remained an important question, that encounter. But there was something else. There were different groups of people living in these towns. This notion of a shtetl, of a Jewish town, was really part of a figment of the literary imagination. There were no such purely Jewish towns. All these towns had mixed populations. And Buczacz was a mixed town. It had Jews, it had Poles, and it had Ukrainians in it. And the relations between these groups determined the nature of the encounter itself. There was no simple encounter between the German perpetrators and the Jewish victims. There was everybody else. And everyone played a role in what happened. And so once I understood that, I realized that I could not begin at the end. I could not begin at the moment in which the Germans come and start killing, although it is a very important moment. I had to start much earlier. I had to understand what these societies were like before perpetrators came in and started doing the killing, and why those relations between them influenced, and how they influenced the manner in which the killing actually occurred. And so that took me on a long journey, and I'm not going to take you through the entire journey now, into the past, to try and understand what was this town, and what were hundreds of towns like it, and how did relations develop in those towns between these different groups. So I'll give you a very brief survey. You can see Buczacz was a town that existed already in the Middle Ages. The first records are from 1260 as an estate at the time. It was for much of its existence a private town. It belonged to a noble Polish family, the Potocki family, and it was a border town on the borderlands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, part of a long series of border towns that were supposed to protect that vast empire that most people don't remember, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, from invasions from the south by the Ottomans and from the east by the Cossacks and the Tatars. Now, in 1772, Poland was partitioned. And by the end of the 18th century, Poland had disappeared. In the first partition, that part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was torn away from Poland and annexed by the Habsburg Empire, which called that region Galicia, or Galician. It gave it this name for dynastic reasons to justify the annexation. And Buczacz found itself in that province of Galicia on the eastern rim of the easternmost and poorest province of the Habsburg Empire. And what was important about that province, and especially about the eastern part of that province, was that the majority population there were what we call now Ukrainians. They were called then Ruthenians by the Ruthenen, by the Habsburg rule. The second largest were Poles, and the largest concentration of Jews in the entire Habsburg Empire lived in Galicia. They also were all quite poor. It was, as I said, one of the poorest provinces of the empire. Now, this empire also disappeared at the end of World War I, and from remnants of it, Poland was resurrected. The Poland that disappeared in the late 18th century re-emerged in 1918. But that Poland, which saw itself as a nation state, as the state of the Poles, in fact was only 60% Polish. And 40% of the population were of other ethnic groups. 20% of them were Ukrainians, and 10% of them were Jews, and then there were also ethnic Germans, Lithuanians, Belarusians, and so forth. And the eastern part, as you can see, of Poland was what had been Galicia, and was an area in which the majority population was Ukrainian. And I'll get back to that in a minute. Now, what we have to understand then is that in these towns, such as Buczacz, Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews had lived together at least since the 16th century. In Buczacz specifically, there are gravestones from the second third of the 16th century. And so these groups lived side by side. Now, they were recognized according to their languages. They spoke different languages, although there was a similarity between Polish and Ukrainian. They were distinguished by their religion. The Ukrainians were Greek Catholic, the Poles were Roman Catholic, and the Jews were Jews. They were often also recognized by their socioeconomic roles in society, but they also did not know any other existence but an existence together. There was no other memory of having once been apart. So these towns were multi-ethnic and multi-religious towns, as was, of course, the empire itself, the Habsburg Empire itself. Now, we shouldn't idealize this. This was not a pluralistic society. It was not a multicultural society. People had a sense of their ethnic identity, and there were resentments and discomforts between the groups, and there were periods of violence. The most important period of violence was the 17th century, first with the uprising of the Cossacks in 1648, and then with the wars against the Turks. So this was not an entirely peaceful, ideal society. But what is important is that from 1700 until World War I, there was very little violence in that area, and people lived side by side relatively peacefully. And our view of Eastern Europe, that the West often has, that it's made of groups that are always prepared to jump at each other's throat, is simply untrue. There were societies that had managed to find a way of existing together and depended one upon the other. So what was it that made for the kind of violence that we saw in World War II between these groups? Where did that violence come from? And I would say that the most important element was the rise of nationalism in that area in the latter part of the 19th century. Clearly, some of the violence that I'll talk about in World War I and World War II had to do with the entry into these areas of other empires, of armies that brought violence there. But much of it was generated from within. And the violence from without exploited the tensions within to implement its own goals. So from the late 19th century, there is a growth of nationalism in that area. It begins with Polish nationalism, then Ukrainian nationalism, and later on also Jewish nationalism. And to make a very long story short, what is the Polish narrative of these areas? The Poles spoke of themselves as having come to those wild parts of the East to civilize them. They had a civilizing mission. They built cities, they organized commerce, they were, in a sense, creating a new Polish civilization. And they spoke about the population there, the Ruthenian population, as people who could eventually be transformed into Poles, into some people who would be like them. They are basically Poles, they're just a bit more primitive and need to be made, cultivated. The Ukrainian narrative was obviously very different. The Ukrainian national narrative was that the Ukrainians were the indigenous population of these areas, and they had been colonized by the Poles, who exploited them, who served them, and who used the Jews as their lackeys, as the people who leased their estates, sold them alcohol, subjected them to violence. So the Ukrainian narrative is very much one of subjugation, of exploitation, and of a need to have independence from those foreigners who had invaded their lands. The Jewish narrative initially does not have, unlike the Polish and Ukrainian one, is not about land. Because both Ukrainians and Poles, the main argument was, who does the land belong to and who belongs to the land? Is it mine or is it yours? Is it Ukrainian or is it Polish? Or are Ukrainians actually Poles, or are Poles just invaders from the outside? Jews did not actually argue for having ownership on the land. They spoke about the fact that they had brought commerce to these areas, that they had brought education. But in some ways, the Jewish narrative in those areas was one of transition. That in a sense, the Jews were on the way to another place. They had, as Agnon called it, just stopped for a night on the way to going back to the Holy Land. And that night lasted about 400 years, but their intention was to ultimately end in the Holy Land. Now, when Jewish nationalism began in those areas, it largely was Zionism. Zionism was very strong in Eastern Poland, or what had been Eastern Galicia. Now, Zionism took much of its narrative from Polish and Ukrainian nationalism. It was ethnic and it was territorial. But the territory that he spoke about was not that territory. The territory he spoke about was the territory of Palestine. And so in that sense, it was not competing with Poles and Ukrainians over the land. And if there was one thing that Poles and Ukrainian nationalists agreed on, was that in their future nation state, in the states that they wanted to create, there was no place for Jews. This was one thing that they had in common. Now, while these narratives are created, and obviously they have a great deal of antagonism in them, there was still very little violence. And that is partly because the area was still ruled by the Habsburg Empire that was not managed to somehow keep the violence down while it allowed for these nationalisms to grow. And in this, as you can see in this photo, which is a rather incredible picture from 1907, this was the only democratic election ever held in Galicia. And people identified by parties according to their ethnic or national group. But because the Poles were the most powerful group in that area, politically, Jews and Ukrainians formed coalitions, party coalitions in that election. So there was also cooperation between the different groups, even though the rhetoric itself becomes increasingly violent. Now, all of that changed in World War I, and World War I is a crucial moment that we often forget, because World War II and all the destruction of that war has obliterated what we should have known about the role that World War I played leading to the destruction later on. So World War I in Eastern Europe is extremely destructive. It's destructive of cities, it's destructive of people. There are hundreds of thousands of people killed all over. There are tens of thousands just in the area of Buczacz itself. The town is occupied twice by the Russian army. The Russian army, when it marches in, brings in a great deal of violence, particularly against Jews, much of which is perceived by their neighbors, who see both Cossack pogroms and also Russian rule that is especially violent against Jews. There are also great movements of populations, deportations and escapes. People are fleeing Russian rule. And so the war is very, very destructive and shows the cheapness of human life. Buczacz itself is heavily destroyed. There is an account by, a fascinating account by a soldier who served, Abalev his name is, who served in the Russian army and who comes to Buczacz in June 1916, just as it is recaptured by the Russian army in the Brusilov offensive. Maybe some of you know about that famous offensive. And he describes the pogrom that had just taken place. He just sees the results of that pogrom, and it's pretty hair-raising. I have an account by a Polish school teacher from that period who is a Polish nationalist and anti-Semitic and not particularly pro-Russian and doesn't think much of Ukrainians. But what is interesting in his account is, because he's a teacher, he says about what horrible effect these events will have on the children when they grow up, because the children have been exposed to this violence for 7 years. And these children who were exposed to that are the nationalists of the 1930s. They are the people who then become even more violent than their parents were. Not only that, the war in the East does not end in 1918. So in the West, people celebrate the end of World War I in November. It didn't end there, because the moment the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, a war began between Poles and Ukrainians over this territory. Ukrainians wanted to make that into an independent Ukrainian state, and the Poles wanted it to be part of resurrected Poland. And that war is extremely vicious, and it's particularly bad because so much of the violence is against civilians. There's so many massacres there, as well as quite a number of pogroms against Jews, particularly because Jews are seen as not being, either being the friend of your enemy or trying to keep neutral. So that by the time Poland finally is in control of this area, and it remains from 1921 until 1939, this is part of Poland, a new situation has arisen. By now you have Ukrainians who have become nationalized. and who feel that they had not succeeded in gaining their own independence and their own national identity, and they're continuously suppressed by the Polish authorities, by the Polish police, and often the Polish military. There's a pacification campaign in 1930 that is particularly brutal. The response to that is the creation of a terrorist underground, it's created in 1929, known by its acronym OUN, which is the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. That is a fascist organization. It's influenced by other fascist organizations throughout Eastern Europe, and after 1933, it's increasingly associated also with the Nazi regime in Germany and supported by the Nazis. That organization is sworn to creating a Pole-free and Jew-free Ukraine. And its rhetoric is extremely violent, and it's waiting for the moment to be able to implement what it wants to implement, which it knows would happen only if there's another war. The Jews in towns like Buczacz, some of the young Jews who are quite desperate after World War I because of all the violence there and because the community has been terribly impoverished, and Agnon writes about that. He visited Buczacz once in 1930 and wrote a beautiful novel on that called A Guest for a Night. If you want to read a good novel, I recommend it. So those young people, the young Zionists, some of them go to Palestine in the 1920s. And not all of them stay there. It's a very hard place to live in at the time. But they are a very small fraction of the population. Most of the people remain there. And by the 1930s, it becomes increasingly difficult to leave. So what we have to understand is that by the 1930s, a little bit like today, because there is an economic depression, countries don't like refugees. It's very hard for people to leave because nobody wants them. The United States actually passes a law already in 1924, which is largely geared against immigration of Jews from Eastern Europe. In 1936, there's an Arab uprising in Palestine, and the British authorities, Palestine is under British mandatory rule. The British authorities restrict immigration to Palestine. So my grandfather was pretty smart. He got his certificate to Palestine just before that happened. By 1936, it would have been much more difficult. And there is growing anti-Semitism within that area, both popular and official. In 1935, the ruler of Poland, Pilsudski, dies, and there is more and more official anti-Semitism. It's very hard for Jews to get into university or into good high schools or to find any jobs. So they're stuck. Some of them turn to communism. In fact, there is one communist cell in Buczacz, and that cell is almost entirely Jewish. It's an extremely inefficient communist cell. It's penetrated right away by the Polish police. They have a mole there. So we know a lot about it because of this mole who was reporting to the police. So it's not doing much, and it cannot recruit the masses, because the masses it wants to recruit are the Ukrainian masses, and they're not going to be led by them. They've been nationalized. They're not going to be led by a bunch of Jewish working class kids from the town. Some of those communists, however, later on reappear. Those who survive reappear under German rule, and they're among those who actually create a resistance against German rule and largely really against Ukrainian collaborators. And they're mostly killed in the process. Now, the last thing we need to know is that in 1939, as some of you may know, this area is not occupied by Germany, but by the Soviet Union. In the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, Poland is divided between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And the Soviet Union gets Eastern Poland. And so Galicia comes under Soviet rule, not German rule. And for 2 years, the Soviets do there what the Soviets do best. They first of all destroy an economy that already was in a shambles. They nationalized the economy so that from being poor, now people are actually lacking food. There are very long bread lines. There's a sense of deprivation. And secondly, they start going against different groups that they see as their enemies, as their social enemies and as their political enemies. They deport large numbers of Poles. They deport the Polish ruling class, the aristocracy, officer families, and so forth. Then they turn against the Jews, and they deport Jews both as class enemies, because they may have a shoe store or a carpentry, and they deport them for political reasons, if they're Zionists. And then they turn against the Ukrainians, who had initially welcomed Soviet rule because they saw it as liberating them from Polish rule and as uniting the Poles of the Ukrainians of Western Ukraine with the rest of Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine. But within a year or so, they realized that this is not the kind of liberation they wanted, and they start organizing against the Soviets, and the Soviets incarcerate large numbers of mostly Ukrainian nationalists in local jails. And that's the moment in which Nazi Germany attacks the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. And what happens is a wave of extraordinary violence. Some of it is popular, and some of it is increasingly organized. So the Soviets, the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, get an order to either remove their political prisoners with them as they withdraw, or to kill them. Of course, they kill them. It's much easier. So they kill between 7,000 to 10,000 political prisoners in local jails. And then they withdraw. The local population, those people who were killed were their relatives, were their sons, fathers, take up the notion that they were killed by Judeo-Bolsheviks. And they begin vast killing sprees against the Jews in their own towns. In many of the towns, the largest events happen in Lemberg, Lvov, but they happen all over this area. This is even before the German army comes in. Once the German army arrives, and behind it arrive the Einsatzgruppen and the Sicherheitspolizei, they then use this popular sentiment against Jews and only heighten it. And so there's a wave of extraordinary killing with about 20,000 people who are killed publicly right in the early stages of the Soviet withdrawal and the entrance of the Red Army. And meanwhile, in towns such as Buczacz, Ukrainian nationalists organize militias. And these militias are supposed to now carry out the goal of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, to create an independent Ukraine free of Poles and Jews. They are initially seen as very useful for German rule. Now, it's not that the Germans actually thought of creating an independent Ukraine, but they certainly think that they can make use of the fact that there are Ukrainian nationalists who are willing to work with them, militarized Ukrainians. And the entrance of the Germans into towns such as Buczacz is celebrated by the local population, as you can see here, marching with traditional Ukrainian clothes, with German Nazis in the back giving the Hitler salute as the Ukrainians march. Now, what the Germans do, in fact, they convert these militias, which spring out just as the Soviets are leaving, into auxiliary police forces. And those are extremely useful to what the Germans actually have in mind. By 1943, as the German army is beginning a long retreat from the Soviet Union, they also recruit an entire Waffen-SS division, Galician, so about 18,000 young Ukrainians, including hundreds from Buczacz, are recruited to a Ukrainian SS division that is later moored in the Battle of Brody. And those who survive that battle become soldiers of the Ukrainian insurgent army that I'll talk about in a minute. Now, what is most important for the Germans who come to what they call now, what is now called District Galician, which is part of the Generalgouvernement, is to exterminate the Jewish population in that area. That's the main goal of the security police. Now, you should understand that the security police in that area is very, very thin on the ground. There's very few people actually in that police. In the area of Buczacz and another town nearby, Chortkov, there are about 20 Sicherheitspolizei members. Some are German, some are not even from Germany. Some are ethnic Germans from Lithuania, from Czechoslovakia, from Poland, and some of them speak Slavic languages. Those 20 men, between late summer 1942 and early summer 1943, kill an estimated 60,000 Jews. Right? So in less than a year, they kill an estimated 60,000 Jews. When they're not killing Jews, they're having a very good time. And when they talked about it later on, those of them who were brought to justice, not many were, but those who were, in the late 1950s and 1960s, when they and others testified, they still remembered those years there as the best years of their lives. Because their lives before the war mostly were not so interesting. Some were policemen, many of them were policemen, some were car salesmen. And after the war, they didn't have such great lives either. But during the war, they had a fantastic time. They had absolute, complete access to food, total access to as much alcohol as they wanted, as much tobacco as they wanted. There was a tobacco factory there in Monastirzysta, which is in the same area. Complete access to sex. They could have as much sex with whoever they wanted. And there was a lot of sex, enforced sex, of course, rape against Jewish women, despite the fact that officially this was not supposed to happen because nobody was looking. And they had, of course, complete power over life and death. They could kill or not kill, or kill however they wished to kill, often in rather gruesome ways, without any control whatsoever. They were having such a good time there that they brought their families. They brought their wives, they brought their children, they brought their parents, they brought mistresses or had local mistresses. They went horse riding, they went skiing. They were having a very nice time. Now, while they were there, as I said, the killing mostly begins in late summer 1942, but they arrive in the summer of 1941. So between the beginning of German rule and the killing that begins a year later, they get to know the locals. They get to know the Ukrainians, of course, because in fact, 20 people cannot kill 60,000 on their own. So they have a battalion of Ukrainian auxiliary police, about 300 men, whom they use for this purpose, to round up people, to bring them to the killing sites or to the deportation trains. They have local police forces. They have gendarmes, German gendarmes in every town, including in Buczacz, about 10, 12 local. These are uniformed policemen. They're older people. They have children at home. They're in their 30s, some of them in their 40s. They have local Ukrainian police, and they have local Jewish police. They have a Jewish council and Jewish police. And all of these people are used in order to facilitate bringing the population either to the train station or to the killing sites. They also get to know the Jews. And that's important to understand. They use the Jews on the ground before they start killing them as their babysitters, as their maids, as their dentists, as their doctors, as their tailors. Jews come in and out of their homes. They know them by name. And the Jews know them by name. So that by the time the killing begins, we have many accounts of people saying, one saying, but I was your barber before he's being shot. They know each other. These are very intimate relations by them because these are small communities. And people live one with each other. Now, just to get an idea of how close everything was, I should say that in Galicia as a whole, in District Galician, there were about 500,000 Jews, and about half of them, about 250,000, were deported by train to Buczacz, which was the designated extermination camp. It's on the Polish-Ukrainian border, and gassed there. Even those who were taken to Buczacz, first of all, lived for that year together with Germans, Ukrainians, and so forth. And the roundups themselves were extremely violent. It did not look like what I talked about Grunewald. There were hundreds of people killed on the street. These were extremely violent events by the time people were pushed into trains and taken away. The second half, and in Buczacz it's more than half, were killed in situ. And they were killed in the place because Buczacz is closed by the end of 1942. So from the beginning of 1943, and that's the opposite of what the historiography will tell you, from the beginning of 1943, the killing is actually one-on-one. And people are killed right next to where they live. Either on the street when they're rounded up, but mostly in killing sites. If you look at this map, you will see, do I have a laser on this? Oh, I can't point. Maybe I do. I don't know where to press. Is it here? So this is an aerial photo taken by the Luftwaffe in April 1944. So the town is mostly here. There's a little bit here, but most of it is here. And there are two killing sites. One is the Jewish cemetery, which is here, and one is a hill called the Federal Hill right here. There's a monastery here, and there's a hill here. So if you're standing in the middle of the town, you can see both sides. If you're standing on one side, you can see the other side. If you're standing here, you can hear gunshots, either from here or from here. And many people also went to watch the killings, those who didn't participate. There were locals who wanted to see what it looks like. There were Germans who were there not as policemen and not as administrators. There were engineers, there were foremen, they were building the railroad bridge that had been blown up by the Soviets. People actually go to see what it looks like when you kill thousands of people in front of pits. So this was very, very intimate. Now, about 10,000 Jews were killed in Buczacz. Buczacz in 1939 had about 15,000 inhabitants, of which about 8,000 were Jews and the rest were Poles and Ukrainians. So more Jews were killed in Buczacz than actually lived there because Jews were brought from outside, from other towns and villages, to be killed there because it was easier to concentrate them. Now, once this killing ends, although there's still Jews living in the area and the killing continues sporadically all the way to the end of the German occupation there, which is in July 1944, another round of killing begins. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, that now has also the Ukrainian Insurgent Army as its armed section, begins killing of Poles first in Volhynia, which is a province just northeast of Galicia, and in early 1944 begins coming down to Galicia and begins ethnic cleansing of the Polish population there. Now, this has got nothing to do with German policy. The German authorities, they are very glad about the Ukrainians helping them kill the Jews, and it's mostly Ukrainian policemen who are doing the work, not Poles so much. But they have no interest in the conflict between Poles and Ukrainians. In fact, Poles are more likely to be held by Germans there than Ukrainians. Germans help Poles escape from there, and Jews are more likely to be held by Poles than by Ukrainians there, because Poles feel that they themselves are under threat, and there's a little bit of empathy for another group that had already been persecuted and killed. Now, the Poles don't take this attack on the community sitting down. They have also the Polish Home Army is involved, and so there are mutual killings and massacres. More Poles are killed than Ukrainians in this area. And by the end of this, and this struggle continues until after the Soviets come into that area, reconquer this area, By the end of this, and also thanks to Soviet policies, that is, of both fighting against the Ukrainian insurgents and deporting Poles outside of this area into what becomes now Poland, and you know Poland moves to the west after the war. Because of this, by 1946, this area becomes finally what Ukrainian nationalists had always wanted it to be. It actually becomes purely Ukrainian. There are no Jews and there are no Poles. The only problem is that it's under Soviet rule, and one has to wait until 1991 before it becomes an independent Ukraine. So Ukrainians until today, this is what they remember very much, is these kind of prisons that they were in, that entire villages were sent off either to exile in Central Asia or to gulags. What they don't remember or don't want to remember are people such as Volodymyr Kaznovsky, who was a district attorney who then became the chief of the Ukrainian police in the area and really organized the Ukrainian henchmen who worked along with the Germans to round up the Jews. The Soviets themselves, when they come there, actually investigate some of these crimes, but what is interesting in the Soviet investigations, which are useful, is that by the end, and one can see it from the drafts, by the end they change the tone of the document. So it begins by speaking about Jews as victims and collaborators among the local population, and by the end of the report they speak about innocent Soviet citizens who were killed by the fascists, and the local population resisted Nazi rule. But shortly thereafter, everything is forgotten. The people you see in this photo who are the survivors, there's about 60 people in this photo out of a population of about 8,000. Those are the people who survived. They put up a monument on the killing site on the Fedor Hill. The monument disappeared shortly thereafter, probably removed by the Soviets, who didn't like Jewish monuments. They thought that the Jews were exaggerating how much they speak about their own victimhood. And the town, after that, entirely forgot about its past, about the fact that it had once had a large Jewish population, a large Polish population, and it forgot about how those people disappeared. So on the killing site, on the Fedor Hill, a forest was planted. There was one memorial put up for one early mass killing of about 450 Jews. But that monument was on the forest floor. It was broken for about 40 years. And later it was put up, so it's standing there, but it's very hard to find it. You need a local guide because it's deep in the forest and there are no signs how to find it. There is a large memorial there, but that memorial is to the Ukrainian martyrs in the battle for liberation of Ukraine. And it's done as a traditional memorial mound. More recently, a monument was put up in Buczacz, as in many other towns, on another hill overlooking the town, of Stepan Bandera, who was the commander of the more, or the leader of the more radical faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and is still venerated in Western Ukraine. The Jewish cemetery, which was the other killing site, you can see that if you're standing here, this is the Fedor Hill, this is the town in between, and this is the cemetery. So initially the killings were done on that hill, and toward the end there were many killings done here, and you can see one site from the other. The cemetery was overgrown and neglected and used largely as a garbage dump. More recently, a fence was built around it, not by the locals, but by some people who came from the outside. But I was there last time in 2016, and that fence did not exist yet. There was one memorial put up there, but this memorial too has since been broken. The major Jewish site in the town was this synagogue. That synagogue was heavily damaged during the war, the Great Synagogue, the Goy Hashil. And after the war, a Soviet demolition team came It took them about 5 years to demolish it because it was built like a fortress. These were fortress synagogues. And what they created from it is this elegant kinotheater, Soviet cinema. And the very last Jewish edifice that remained there was the study house that Agnon actually wrote about in his stories. He remembered studying there when he was a child. But that place was demolished by the local mayor in 2001. And so now there's nothing left at all. What we have of the past is the old Polish fortress that had been built there already in the Middle Ages. It was not useful since the 18th century, but if you look at the top, what you see there is the flag of UPA, of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which of course doesn't actually exist, but now that there's a war between Ukraine and Russia, its reputation has been enhanced, and so it's again venerated in Ukraine, especially in Western Ukraine. Now, I want to give you just very quickly a few conclusions from all this journey. And I'll do this quickly, and hopefully that'll bring some conversation. So one issue that I understood from studying this was that the genocidal encounter, what I tried to understand when I started this, between the perpetrators and the victims on the local level was intimate. It was not detached. That is, people knew each other. They often knew each other by name. They were not anonymous. Secondly, that the killing was public and not secret. There were a lot of debates in German historiography or historiography of Germany as to what did people know in Germany during the war. The extermination camps were secret. Did people know about it? In these cases, there's no question. Everybody knew all the time. It was happening right in front of you. It was happening on the street. Or the killing was completely public. There was no attempt to make it secret. Third, and consequently, the category of bystanders, because we like to talk about victims, perpetrators, and bystanders, and we like to associate ourselves, if not with the victims, then with the bystanders. We certainly don't want to think of ourselves as perpetrators, and we think that the majority are bystanders. But this category of bystanders is largely meaningless in such towns, in such small towns, because everyone becomes part of it. And if you think of somebody living in an apartment house, and the people living on the 4th floor are taken out and shot on the street, and you know them, your children have studied together, your neighbors, but now they were taken out and killed, and you feel sorry for them. But now their apartment is available, and it's a much better apartment than yours. And it has nice pots and pans and nice blankets and much better air. It's on the 4th floor. So if you don't move in, somebody else will move in, maybe the neighbors from the 3rd floor. So you move in, and once you move in, you become part of the process. You begin profiting from genocide. And genocide for many people is profitable. It is, in fact, about property. And especially if you live in poor areas, you really care about every pot and every pan. And so this whole notion of bystanders becomes rather meaningless. And fourth, again, connected to that, is what I call in the book an ambiguity of goodness. Because we like to think, okay, they're bad people. We know there were Gestapo people, they were really bad. There were people who just did the killing. We have no sympathy for them. We say we can't even understand their mentality, although if we knew them before the war, after the war, they were policemen in our town. They helped old women cross the street. But we are told that they are really, really bad. And then there are people that we think are really good. They're altruistic. They did things that we would not do. But the truth of the matter is that most people are in between. And there were so many people in all these towns who saved, and no Jew, or hardly any Jew survived, of the few survived without being helped by neighbors. In this case, by Poles or Ukrainians, by Christian neighbors. It was almost impossible to survive without it. But so many of those who were sheltered by their neighbors were also denounced by their neighbors, and often by the same people who sheltered them. And there were reasons for that. There were specific reasons why someone who would shelter you at some point would denounce you, because you ran out of money, because somebody was about to tell on them. There were all kinds of reasons, and they make sense. But what they mean is that there is an ambiguity of goodness. There were people who were killers at one point and victims at another. And it depends on the historical moment. And so when we look at genocide on this local level, we start being liberated of these stereotypes that we like to have because they help us understand it or think that we understand it. Another point is that the nature of such an event, and that was why I went on this long journey, can often be understood only if you look at it from the beginning. You don't start at the end. The Germans come into Buczacz and start killing Jews. But how they do it, why they can basically carry it out with extensive cooperation from the local population, we have to understand that. And we have to understand why that was possible. And that we cannot understand if we begin at the end, if we begin right when the killing starts. Another point that for me was very important, and a lot of historians have tried to avoid it for a long time, was that in order to understand this, and I must say a lot of German historians didn't do that, is to use personal accounts. So we have a colleague, say Dieter Pohl, who wrote on the genocide in Galicia. And he used Polish sources, Ukrainian sources, German sources, Russian sources, but he didn't use any Jewish sources at all. He called them Jewish sources. What it means is that you get a very simplified picture of what happens. What you understand is how this event occurred through the perspective of the organizers, through the perspective of the killers. You never get the view of the people who are actually subjected to that. You also miss entire episodes of that history. One of the most extraordinary things that I discovered in Buczacz is that in this region, it's not only in Buczacz, is that between March and July 1944, there's huge amount of local violence there because the German rule is disintegrating. The Gestapo is already leaving. The Sicherheitspolizei, they don't like it when there's actual fighting. They go to safer places. But there's a lot of local violence by peasants, by all kind of broken up units, by soldiers who've left. And one Wehrmacht officer comes to a nearby town called Tłuste, near Buczacz. And he comes from the Eastern Front. We don't know his name. We know about him only from Jewish accounts. And this man says to some of the Jews who are in this town, he says he's appalled by what the Ukrainians are doing to them, and he's going to protect them until the Red Army comes. And what is extraordinary is that the rumor that there is this guy in Tłuste who is protecting Jews, a German officer, this rumor goes around the forest, and Jews start coming to Tłuste to be saved by this man. And about 600 Jews end up in this town being protected by this man. Now, it's not him boasting because we don't have his voice at all. We only know about him from them. And he stays there until about 2 hours before the Red Army comes in. Tragically, once he leaves and the Red Army comes in, the Luftwaffe also comes and bombs this town and kills about half of those people that he helped survive. But the story is that if you listen to those who told their accounts because they wanted them to be part of history, you get a very different picture of those events from what you would get if you read only official documentation. And I'll give you just two last points. One is that our perceptions, if we look at this event through the eyes of the different protagonists, our perceptions of such issues as collaboration, of betrayal, of heroism, of liberation, differ dramatically depending on who is doing the talking, who is doing the witnessing, and about which time they're talking. Jews certainly felt that they were liberated by the Red Army. And there were Jews who saw Red Army officers who were Jews and who tried to identify themselves as Jews to the survivors by saying a couple of words in broken Yiddish to show them that they were Jews. For Jews, this was a miracle. For Ukrainians, the Red Army does not come to liberate them. It comes to reoccupy them. And when they see Jewish Red Army officers, for them it's only proof that they are Judeo-Bolsheviks, that in fact the Jews are ruling the Soviet Union. The same question with betrayal, with heroism. One side's heroes are the other side's perpetrators. The Ukraine after 1991 rediscovered its liberation fighters. Stepan Bandera, the head of the OUN-B, became a national hero. He, of course, was remembered, and the people under him, as the Banderites, the Banderivtsi, the Banderovtsi. They were the people who, in Jewish memories, were those who killed him. So for them, he was the head of the gangs. For Ukrainians, after the Soviets were gone, and the Soviets assassinated him in 1956, I think in Munich, or in Vienna, I'm not sure, I think in Munich, the KGB assassinated him. For Ukrainians, he's a national hero, and you go to bookstores in Lviv now and you find them. And the final point that I make is that, after I did all of this, and only in the last 2-3 years, I started thinking about this entire event a bit differently. Probably because of things that are happening right now in our world, which is changing. And I realized that the kind of sense that we have of security, that there's a law, that there's a police force, that if something happens, we can call the police and they'll come and take care of it. Or if there's somebody who is being caught committing a crime, they'll be taken to court and they'll be tried, and there will be some justice and some security. That this crust of social order and of respect for each other and for the law and for the system that maintains it is very easily fractured. And that once it's fractured, we are left actually quite helpless. And I was thinking about this. I was speaking in a community college in Brooklyn, where many of the people sitting in the audience were students who were black, who were Muslims, who were covered women, who were people who had a different relationship with the police and with the authorities. And I was saying, if one day you wake up at 2 in the morning and you hear some noise on the street and you're worried maybe there's a robbery, and you call the police and the police come and they arrest you. And you think, what? But it's not me. But now you've been arrested. Your entire trust in the system starts collapsing. And the next day, your neighbor, whom you always said hello to in the morning when you went to work and hello to when you came back from work, comes into your house with an axe and takes your TV away. And you realize you have no protection. You realize the law that you thought was on your side is not on your side. And for me, this was a sobering thought. That in fact events that happened very far away in Eastern Europe and a long time ago can actually be reenacted in this time and this place. So thank you.
So thank you very much. Vielen herzlichen Dank, Professor Bartov. Weil die Zeit schon ein bisschen fortgeschritten ist, haben wir gesagt, wir machen noch ganz kurz die Möglichkeit für Fragen zu stellen. Wenn es im Publikum dringende Nachfragen, Kommentare gibt.
Thank you very much for your presentation here. Actually, I have one question. You started with your story in the 16th century, talking about Buczacz. And you mentioned that there were living mostly Poles, a lot of Ukrainians, and Jewish people. Actually, I'm a little bit surprised that you mix up nationalism and a religion, starting with the history in the 16th century. I mean, we all know the history of the Holocaust, but talking about Germany and the Holocaust, but talking about the First World War, the Jews in Germany, they did not only feel as Jews, they also felt as Germans, and they fought for Germany. But in Eastern Europe, actually, how felt the Jews there? As Poles, as Ukrainians, or what kind of nationalism? Because being a Jew, for me, is being a part of a religious group.
That's a good question. And I couldn't speak about all of this, of course, here. The question of Jews in Germany in World War I is a very interesting one. We could talk about it for a long time, because Jews did fight for Germany in World War I. And the German army also had a Judendzählung in World War I to identify Jews as Jews. And at the end of World War I, there was a very strong argument being made that was later picked up by the Nazis as well, that the Jews and the socialists were both synonymous and it stabbed Germany in the back. So the story is complicated, to say the least. The story in Eastern Europe, certainly in these areas, and the Habsburg, is interesting because in World War I in the East, most of the people fighting for the empire, for the Habsburg Empire, are not fighting for the empire. So the Poles are organized in Polish legions, and what they are fighting for and what they say they are fighting for is for an independent Poland. They're doing it in the uniforms of the Austrian army. The Ukrainians are fighting in siege units. They take this term from the 16th century, from Khmelnytsky, from the Cossack siege. But I won't go into that. But they are fighting to create an independent Ukraine. The only people who are fighting in this region for the empire are the Jews. And they are known as Kaisertreu. And they're Kaisertreu because they realize that if the empire goes, it will be replaced likely by nation states, such as the Ukrainian state and a Polish state. And as I said, those states have only one thing that they agree on, and that's that they don't want Jews there. And their whole national rhetoric is about that. And so that is quite different, of course, in Eastern Europe from what it is in Western Europe. But one should not idealize events in Western Europe, and certainly not in Germany in World War I. So many Jews coming back from World War I in Germany had encountered a great deal of anti-Semitism during the war, which shocked them because they wanted to fight for Germany and to show that they were as good as all the other Germans. I mean, Catholics also were doing it to an extent, but the sentiment against Jews was very strong and was, of course, whipped up later on in the 1920s. So it is a complicated story. As for whether Jews are a religion or an ethnic group, there was a debate over that already in the Roman Empire. Who is a Jew? So we are not going to resolve it here, but clearly there were Jews, certainly in the modern period, who said that they were Germans of Mosaic faith, that they were Israelites in that sense, Israelite. And I think they truly believed it, and they were usually 1 or 2 generations removed from traditional Jewish life, which saw things very differently. Jews lived separate from others in many ways for much of Jewish existence in Europe. But there's a moment in the 18th century and the 19th century, the Jews do say we are like everyone else, only we have a different religion. But there was resistance to it both from the Jewish world and from the Christian world. And nationalism, and not least, certainly nationalism in Germany, responds very unhappily to this notion of Jews. I'm sure you know, if you read Treitschke's lectures that were published in the late 19th century, was a very famous and influential historian. He spoke about the fact that the Jews are our misfortune. He invented this term. And he says that the Jews are not allowing the Germans to develop their own culture. They are bringing into it something foreign. And so within nationalism, all these ethnic, territorial nationalisms, Jews were a difficult phenomenon to deal with, both for themselves and for others. So I would say, don't idealize.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is, so after they plant trees over everything and they hide their monuments in the forest, and then comes a Jew, which is you, and researches the whole thing. So how did they react to that? I mean, how was the reaction to you coming and saying, well, this was not a happy place, was it? Was there one, or did you actually just work in the archives, so you didn't actually talk to people, or people didn't encounter you, or was there any kind of reaction? So that's the one thing. And the other thing is, was there any kind of organized resistance, or was there just individual acts of benevolence, or, you know, or pity, or however you want to call it?
Great. As to how people responded, so there's not much research, actual archival research, to be done in a town like Buczacz, because there's nothing much there. There's no memory and there's no archive. But even when I went to slightly larger towns, if I did research in Ternopil, in Lviv, I must say, mostly people responded to me not as a Jew. They thought of me as an American. Now, I think that for some, it's the same thing. You know, there's Judeo-Bolshevism, there's Judeo-Americanism, or whatever it is. But they thought of me as American, which for me was kind of funny, because I identify more as coming from Israel. But, you know, there it is. But there were certainly nationalists who did not like it. So people who were ideological. There were more often, I would say, in smaller places, people are worried. And as I said, Eastern Europe, genocide in general, and in Eastern Europe in particular, but in Germany it was too, a lot of this is about property. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people living in stolen property. Now, they didn't steal it themselves by now, of course, but at some point it was stolen, and there is a kind of collective memory of it. And if somebody comes to a small town, and small towns or villages generally don't like foreigners very much, and starts asking questions, people get really worried that somebody might take their little shack away. And so there is discomfort. On the other hand, I encountered some very nice people. And the one thing that I found most interesting when I worked in the archive in Lviv was that they assumed that I came to look for documents about Jews as an American. And when I said, no, I'm actually interested in documents about Poles and Ukrainians too. So I got this big smile, and they said, oh, yeah, well, we'll show you. So the very fact that I was not writing a history of the Jews, I was writing a history of everybody. And people felt better about that, precisely because somehow, certainly people working in archives were aware of the fact that that had been forgotten. That is a history. And in the archive, it's still there. I sat in an archive in Lviv going through documents written in Hebrew in the 1920s and 30s. So I mean, it's all there, that multiplicity of nations, languages, cultures is in the archive. It's not outdoors anymore, but it's right there. And so I think I wouldn't say it was all negative. The same with Ukrainian historians, by the way. The older generation are still very nationalist. But there are young historians who are learning a lot of languages, and they are interested in... I talked in Kiev about this book to young college teachers, and they know very little, and they were very, very interested to hear this history that they can hardly find anywhere in Ukrainian. Now, on your second question on resistance, that's also a very interesting question. There was a lot of resistance, but the question is, to what and to whom? And when you look at this place, you realize, so no one was really fighting the Germans. They were too strong. Most of the resistance, the Poles are mostly fighting the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians are mostly fighting the Poles. And if you read their accounts after the war, what they remember from the war is their Polish or Ukrainian neighbors. They have very little to say about the Jews. The Jews, on the other hand, when they write, they have very little to say about the Germans. Because the Germans, well, one knew, they understood quite quickly. They came to kill them. But the Poles and Ukrainians, their neighbors, those people really matter. Because they either will denounce you or save you. You can't survive without them, but they also know who you are. And the Germans coming in, they can't really tell the difference. So they are those who can be a roadmap to the perpetrators, or they can save you. The other resistance that exists, Jewish resistance, is interesting on two levels that I'll very quickly say. One is, and I personally, because I was educated in Israel, I got a good Zionist education, and we learned that we should admire the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and that the rest of the Jews went like sheep to the slaughter and all that. That in fact, quite a number of the people who were in the Jewish resistance before that were in the Jewish police. And that the distinction we make between the two is, again, we'd like to make it for moral reasons. It makes us feel more comfortable. We know the bad guys and the good guys. But in reality, they were young men, and they wanted to survive. And they also wanted to save their parents, their siblings. And so if you served in the police, you had a bit more of a chance to survive. Not forever, but for a while. You got better food. But you also had then to go to so-called bunkers and drag people out of them and hand them over to the Ukrainians or to the Germans. Once the Ukrainian police, on orders from the Germans or not, decides to do away with the Jewish police at the end of when the area is declared Judenrein, then those people fight back, and some of them escape to the forest, and now they become resistors. For the same reason, they want to survive. But what did they do then when they're in the resistance? They don't fight the Germans. They sometimes will raid something because they need weapons. But usually they'll get weapons from Soviet partisans in the area. What they do, they try to kill Ukrainian denouncers because they want to scare the denouncers that if they denounce Jews, there will be revenge. And some of them, and I interviewed some of them many years later, of course, some of them said this is why in March 1944, when Buczacz was liberated for the first time, about 800 Jews came out of shelter, which is a large number. It's, of course, there were 8,000, but still, 800 is a large number. And they said it's because we scared the denouncers. Maybe. The tragedy, of course, was that the Germans stayed there for 2 weeks, and if the Soviets stayed there for 2 weeks, and then they retreated, a tactical retreat for the Red Army, but a disaster for the Jews. It had to do with the Tarnop or Kessel. There was a whole battle there. And when the Germans came back, now they knew where the Jews were, and the Jews couldn't hide anymore. And so they killed almost all of them. This was an SS division, by the way, that came in that time. And so they killed about 700 of the 800 who came out. So resistance was really about who do you fight and for what purpose.
Thank you. It's my understanding that one of the reasons why the concentration camp system was, well, of course, initially it was to imprison communists, but how they switched from doing what I'm assuming at the mass execution sites were point-blank shootings to then sending Jews to or death camps, I should say, was sort of the psychological effect that it was having on the killers, or that was the reasoning behind it. Whereas in some of these accounts, and just from what I garner, it almost seemed as if people became desensitized or had rationalized it in their mind. Is there anything that pointed to this type of psychological breakdown in the killer that I think is normally assumed as why this system switched?
Yeah, so these are three very interesting questions. The first one is that we all tend to confuse between the concentration camps, which exist from 1933 on, and the extermination camps. There were hundreds of concentration camps, mostly not for Jews. About 1 million people died in them or were killed in them, most of them not Jews. So concentration camps served to incarcerate mostly non-Jews. They're for other categories, for work-shy, for socialists, for labor rights, and then for resistors. Poles or French or whatever, right? The extermination camps are very few. There's only 6 of them, of which 2 are also labor camps and concentration camps. That's Auschwitz and Majdanek. The other 4 are very small camps, and their role is to kill Jews, mostly Jews. And in them, about 3 million Jews die in those camps. About half of the total number of Jews who were killed. And as I said, even those Jews, certainly if they come from Eastern Poland or Western Ukraine, are brutalized and are known before they are taken there. So that's one important point. The second, about the logic of it. So the historiography basically tells you that. It tells that initially, the Einsatzgruppen were killing large numbers of Jews one-on-one, and that had a very bad effect on the soldiers, on the policemen. They started drinking and all that, and Himmler didn't like that, and they started thinking, how do we make the whole thing more efficient and take care of the psychology of our own people? As he says in his infamous speech in Posen in October 1943, you know, all of us know what it feels like when you're standing in front of a trench with 500 bodies, 1,000 bodies, and so forth. And they did know that, right? I mean, he's talking to people who actually saw it. Now, from my study, first of all, the order is reversed. In those places, first they take them to the camp, and then they start killing them on the spot. But the second and more important thing is that this idea that it is hard to kill, with those Zippo-Leute, nothing of the sort. It's absolutely extraordinary. They ask in trials later, did you have an Exekutionskommando or something with certain people? They say, no, we didn't need it. That's why. They say because everybody wanted to take part in it. And in fact, there were some people who were particularly brutal and who were doing the killing, but others who were not supposed to participate, drivers, Wachmänner, who were not among the shooters, they say themselves they were waiting around. And if one of the guys who was doing the killing ran out of ammunition, had to change the magazine, they'd pop up and say, well, no, let me do it. You discover that it was not a problem, and that they realized that this power to kill people is so intoxicating that they do it without any difficulty. Additionally, there are people who are, say, gendarmes. And the gendarmes initially, those who are the regular uniformed police in the localities, they initially deny that they participated. Then they say, well, we escorted them, but we were supposed to cordon it off, so we're standing 100 meters outside of it. And then they say, well, yes, we did do a little bit. And then they start describing in great detail precisely how the killing occurs, and you realize that they were also curious about it, that they develop this morbid curiosity. Now, do they also drink when they're doing it? Of course they do. But does it inhibit their actions in any way? Does it make them more efficient? It's organized extremely efficiently, extremely well. And as I say, you find 20 men, with help from others, of course, killing 60,000. And the last thing I would say, which I found extraordinarily striking, you know, I mentioned Gita Sereni because she interviewed Franz Stangl about his experiences as a commandant. And she tries to see whether he at some point will confess to having a guilty conscience, something that he would feel bad about. And she almost gets there with him, but then he has a heart attack and dies. So she never gets there. These people that I'm talking about, none of them ever express any regret, any sense of guilt, any sense of responsibility. They often blame the Jews for having not resisted or not hidden well enough. Whereas in almost every testimony of survivors, you find guilt. You find guilt because they survived and others didn't, because they hid and somebody else was denounced. So you have a reversed Moore universe in which the people who were doing the killing never actually, it appears, at least, because we know what people believe only by what they say, right? We can't get into their heads, but by what they say, they never express any remorse.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Bartov, for an excellent microhistory of Buczacz and at the same time such an important contribution to our understanding of genocide. And I think we could continue the discussion for another hour, but I think you've worked long enough. Thank you all very much for coming, and enjoy your evening here in Munich. And thank you very much for coming, and we all look forward to your next book.